Welcome back to another episode of Misdiagnosed. This is episode 4, and it's called The Top 6 Most Alarming Facts About the DSM, also known as the Bible of Psychiatry. I'm your host, Caitlin Pyle. I'm really excited to dig into this episode because the DSM is probably the most abused and misunderstood thing in the field of mental health, and we as patients are doing ourselves a major disservice if we don't take the time to understand what it is, because if we don't, then the information inside it can be used against us, and it can be fed to us in a way that informs our beliefs about the information inside of it. So largely the purpose of this episode is to lay the foundation for later episodes where we'll be pulling out some of the diagnoses in the DSM and looking at the history and the evolution of those diagnoses, how they became what they are today, and how they're affecting us and our culture. I'd venture to say that most people listening to this, especially if you are new to the idea of mental illness as a social construct, don't know this stuff. This is new. So in the last episode, we talked about how mental illness was invented. It was a social construct. It is a social construct that has informed our beliefs about what mental disorders are. Many of us have been conditioned by men in white coats and other authoritative looking figures to believe that our diagnoses that we've received are lifelong diagnoses, something that we've had since birth. That we've been told that they are hereditary or genetic, or that there's a biochemical imbalance in our brain that causes these mental illnesses. But the truth of the matter is there is no proof of the existence of these disorders. There have been no definitive studies that have identified the chemical imbalance that we've been told we have. There's no test. There's no x-rays. It's simply men in white coats, women in white coats, or maybe they're not wearing a white coat at all. Maybe they're wearing scrubs in the emergency room. They subjectively evaluate based on their observations. They look at us, they talk to us, ask us questions, listen, observe. I say listen, but they probably don't listen at all because they're looking only for symptoms. They're coming in with a bias and belief that you have a mental illness simply because you're in the psych ward emergency room. Ask me how I know. If you listen to the first 3 episodes of this show, you know how I know. So let's get into it. The first, and this is in really no particular order, I kind of organized it in a little bit of a fashion to where it makes sense to me, so I don't leave out things or repeat myself or anything like that. So we're just going to get into the first one. The diagnoses in the DSM were not discovered. They were invented by a committee. And I actually chose to put that one first because it tailwinds off of the last episode where we talked about how mental illness was invented. And the question I want to answer that I didn't in the last episode was why? Why did they invent all of these illnesses? The industry had been losing clout, losing respect, especially from the insurance companies. The insurance companies weren't going to issue payments for the psychiatrist or the hospital's treatments unless they had a diagnosis. So they literally had to come up with diagnoses to be seen as valid in the eyes of insurance companies. The DSM is also used by the court system to help determine insanity. It's used by social services agencies, schools, prisons, and governments. And early versions of the DSM were largely ignored because most people viewed psychiatrists not as real doctors. They, rightly so, viewed them as pseudoscientific, and many of them viewed them as quacks. And that can't be more true than it is today. I think it can be more true. The worse we get into it, the more nonsense they spew about how mental illness has nothing to do with environment, has nothing to do with emotions. They completely ignore the emotion and soul level struggles that we're having and are trying to attribute it mostly to biological causes without any proof because they want to sell us drugs. And the more that they, pathetically, in my opinion, try to pass themselves off as real doctors and using this clever marketing tactics that I have some examples of for you in today's episode, the more obvious to me it becomes that they are quacks and that they're pseudoscientific and they're trying too hard to be seen as valid. But it's crafty. I mean, some of the marketing tactics they're using are quite convincing and manipulative, and it will be contributing my marketing expertise and experience in explaining to you guys how they're doing this. And originally, the DSM was sold primarily to the big state mental hospitals, and it was only $3.50. It was first published in 1952, and a second edition, which is the one I bought off of eBay for $950. It's extremely rare. I couldn't find an original. It's crazy. There was only maybe 20,000 copies of it. I'm not surprised that I can't find it. So the second edition came out in 1968, and it was a spiral-bound paperback of 134 pages. And before the American Psychiatric Association was called the American Psychiatric Association, it was called the Committee on Statistics of the American Medico-Psychological Association. In 1917, that committee published the Statistical Manual for the Use of Institutions for the Insane, which that word is no longer politically correct, is it? And that book outlined the symptoms of only 21 disorders. So the beginnings of the DSM were kind of brewing before the APA was known as the APA. And just for comparison, the first version of the DSM had 128 diagnoses in it. Keeping in mind that one came out in 1968, and the 1917 Manual for the Use of Institutions for the Insane had only the symptoms of 21 disorders outlined in it. The DSM-2, the one that came out in 1968, had 193 diagnoses in it. The DSM-3 had 228 diagnoses. The revised version of the DSM-3 had 253 diagnoses. So doing the math right here on my calculator, that's a difference of 25 diagnoses. So in the time that the DSM-3 and the DSM-3R came out, the revised version, they were somehow able to discover 25 mental disorders. That's what I think they want us to believe. Skipping forward, we've got the DSM-5TR now, which has over 1,000 pages, not including the Roman numeral pages in the beginning, and has almost 300 disorders. And the question remains, where did all of these disorders come from? Because no new empirical research was conducted in between the revisions to back the added diagnoses. In fact, as I've mentioned before, there's no empirical research and no neuroscientific data that exists that proves the existence of any of the diagnoses in the DSM, save for when they mention Huntington's disease or they mention Alzheimer's. There's certainly neuroscientific data that proves the existence of these diagnoses. But I'm talking about the mental disorders that they're trying to index to describe this unapproved, disapproved behavior that deviates from what they consider to be normal in our culture. So even though no new empirical research had been conducted between all of these revisions to the DSM to back up the added diagnoses, the APA still claims that the DSM-5, and this is an exact quote from the fact sheet they have on the APA website that's called Making a Case for New Disorders, quote, the DSM-5 includes new disorders and revised criteria for existing disorders based on the latest scientific evidence and clinical need. Where is that scientific evidence? It also says, quote, any new or substantially modified DSM diagnoses were proposed only after a comprehensive review of the scientific literature. I just want to know where their bibliography, where their works cited page is, where their sources, what their references are, you know? Anybody can say that they've done research. It's like the biggest marketing scam in the world. Say, oh, there's research studies that back it, and who's going to take the time to look at those studies? Most of us aren't. They can still make billions of dollars off the people that they can get to believe that all of their diagnoses are based on scientific literature. A comprehensive review of that. What did that entail? Like, if this is a really scientific field of study, then give me all the details. You know, what comprises a comprehensive review? Is it medically sound? Is it based on the scientific method? I highly, highly doubt it. Fact number 2, the DSM's diagnoses are not true diagnoses from a medical standpoint. We just kind of touched on that. I'm going to expand on it now in a big way. So calling it, first of all, calling it a diagnostic manual is not only pretentious, right? It is factually incorrect. It's absolutely not true because true, real diagnoses indicate the cause of problems. But the diagnoses in the DSM don't indicate a cause. It only lists symptoms and behaviors. Isn't that crazy? What happens, and I know this because it's happened to me many, many times, psychiatrists will observe a patient, they observe you in the hospital, and they make a diagnosis based on their subjective findings alone. Some psychiatrists don't even take a patient's full health or their history into account at all. And it's true. I mean, this is how all of the doctors who evaluated me when I was incarcerated made their diagnoses. They had 5 minutes where they observed me in distress because I was being held against my will in a terrifying, in many cases, dirty place. I was angry, didn't want to be there. I was being traumatized by being out of my home, which is where I'm most comfortable, surrounded by people who think they know me better than me and telling me that I couldn't leave for 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 days. And I learned while I was in there because I made friends with one of the techs. I'm still friends with her today. She told me that some psychiatrists have learned that that's what you're supposed to do, that you make your diagnosis based on observing the patient alone. You don't look at their health history. You don't look at or talk to their doctor. I had to force the guy in the last place. This was in July of 2020, so we're coming up on 2 years. Dr. G, I mentioned him in a previous episode. I had to force him to call my general practitioner. And of course, she supported his diagnosis of me being bipolar, but I don't think she agreed that I needed to be Baker acted at that time. But I had to force him to, because I was like, you have to know what's going on with me. You can't just look at me and, of course I'm talking fast. I don't have a lot of time with you and I know that, and I want you to understand what's going on, and so I'm going to talk fast so I can get it all out. But he just saw that as a symptom, and that's essentially what psychiatrists do. They already have the presumption. They're making the assumption that you have a mental illness because you're in the mental hospital. It's completely flawed logic. But of course, psychiatrists don't take classes in logic. They don't take classes in nutrition or stress resilience. They go to medical school and they learn that decade's version of medical science the way it is. And I don't know if you have ever heard, it's kind of a joke, but what do you call a doctor who got a C- in medical school? Doctor. The DSM is a manual of descriptions, not diagnoses. It's basically a dictionary. They describe behaviors that have been declared symptoms, voted in, like we've mentioned on the show before. They've been declared symptoms of disorders that have not been proved to exist, which is why there's no cause indicated. And I mentioned, I'm going to give you the exact quote from Dr. Daniel Amen. He's a double board certified psychiatrist in neuroscience, and he's the author of The End of Mental Illness. I paraphrased his quote in a previous episode, and I have the exact quote for you here now. Psychiatry is the only medical specialty that virtually never looks at the organ it treats. And of course, he's referring to the brain. And so while there are a good portion of psychiatrists who believe that they're treating brain diseases, they never look at the organ before they treat it, because they're not going to see anything that proves the existence of the illness. It's all based on assumptions. They believe that there's a biochemical imbalance in the brain. They have no proof of that. There's no way to test the imbalance, to find the imbalance. There's no information on how many neurotransmitters there should be, and there's no way to count them. So it's already based on assumptions. Imagine going to a cardiologist and they don't look at your heart. Or imagine going to a podiatrist and they don't look at your foot. Any of those medical specialties, if you go to a hematologist and they don't look at your blood, you go to a dermatologist and they don't look at your skin. It's the same thing here. If these psychiatrists are going to be claiming that they're brain doctors and they don't look at the damn brain, we got a problem. We definitely have a problem, because that's what they do every day. And I've said it before, I'll say it again, probably a gajillion times, will be a broken record if I have to be. No biological test exists to find a cause for any mental disorder. So-called clinical evaluation by a mental health professional is the only tool that's being used consistently by everyone for diagnosis, which makes it inherently biased, and it's subjective based on the observation, also based on the level of consciousness and the awareness of the clinician. Who's diagnosing the shrinks, right? Who's making sure that their level of consciousness and their level of awareness and their level of education is up to par? It's completely biased and subjective. So I submit to you that the DSM could be more accurately called the APA's Mental Disorders Description Manual. And this is echoing an article that I read on the Anti-Psychiatry website, which there's a lot of great articles from contributors on there that bring up excellent points. It's a book of disapproved behavior. You can call it a disapproved behavior description manual. That's basically what it is. And if you have anecdotal evidence, like I do, where I found out that I have Epstein-Barr virus and it had grown out of control. Most of us do have Epstein-Barr virus, and it's a member of the herpes virus family, Epstein-Barr is. And it's stress that causes it to proliferate itself and to get stronger and to take over certain organ systems. So once I figured that out and took steps and changed my diet to make my body very inhospitable to viruses, I saw massive reduction, almost complete elimination of all of the symptoms. I mean, you're never going to be able to completely eliminate these so-called mental health symptoms, because living is hard, right? I still have anxiety sometimes, but I know I don't have an anxiety disorder. I still deal with anxiety, but I'm also able now to check in with myself and understand where the anxiety is coming from and to have conversations with myself, which you know, it's funny that people think of that as a crazy behavior when you have conversations with yourself. Like, people don't treat themselves like humans. And that's, I think, a big issue that causes these so-called mental illness symptoms, is that we don't know how to interact with ourselves and we don't know how to treat ourselves. So anecdotal evidence of how to reduce or eliminate mental illness symptoms gets dismissed, and it's called inadmissible because it's not scientifically valid. What, like the DSM is scientifically valid? It's not, and we're going to get to that. It's one of the facts. It's not. And furthermore, why would the mental health industrial complex want people to know that environmental factors contribute to mental illnesses, that viruses contribute to mental illnesses. If it became public knowledge that anxiety can often be caused by Epstein-Barr virus releasing the neurotoxins into your body, which can affect your brain, and that killing the virus could resolve the symptoms, the big pharma couldn't market anxiety as a disease, and they'd lose billions of dollars on antidepressant sales. And there's lifestyle changes, and that's not just diet and exercise, y'all. It also includes things like seeing a really good therapist and working on recognizing your thought patterns, understanding not just the physical reasons of why you're experiencing depression or anxiety or any of these other symptoms that you may be dealing with, but understanding why you believe the things you do and where those beliefs came from. We all have beliefs, and our beliefs are shaped by the people we hang out with. I'm sure you've heard the quote that you're the sum of the 5 people you hang out with most often. And so if most of your life you've been surrounded by people who are telling you that you can't do it, or that you're crazy, or that you have a disability or a mental illness because that's what they believe, then oftentimes what happens is you adopt those beliefs for yourself, and you don't realize that they were given to you by someone else. You don't actually believe that. It's a type of gaslighting that a lot of people don't realize is gaslighting. So we don't understand our beliefs. We don't even realize that we have beliefs, and we've accepted our beliefs as true and as facts of life. And we don't understand that some of those beliefs may not be true at all. We don't realize the ways that our beliefs might be limiting us in our lives. What often gets brushed under the rug too, when we talk about anecdotal evidence that gets dismissed, there are stories of people who've been given a diagnosis like schizophrenia, then told it was a lifelong condition and that there's no cure. And then they do make changes to their environment and find themselves without the schizophrenia symptoms. Somebody can change their internal environment by increasing emotional intelligence. So there's a book by Brene Brown sitting on my coffee table right now. She also has a TV show based on the same book. It's called Atlas of the Heart. The TV show is on HBO Max. So if you want to watch it, you can. Haven't even cracked open the book yet, but I will. It's on my list, my long list of books. It talks about the language behind emotions and the difficulties that can arise in our relationships with others and with ourselves if we lack the language to describe our emotions. And we're often told that we're often told, but we're often sold the idea that it's a disorder and an illness caused by something wrong in the brain, when it's actually the fact that we're feeling things that we don't know how to describe. We don't have the language to talk about with people. So that can result in what can be construed as erratic behavior or outbursts or other ways that we are attempting to express our emotions because we lack the language. It's really interesting ideas and very relatable ideas. I highly recommend checking it out on either HBO Max or grabbing the book Atlas of the Heart by Brene Brown. And understanding your internal environment is part of emotional intelligence. It's learning to understand how to love and have compassion toward yourself, or even changing what you eat so your brain receives the best possible nutrients for proper functioning. If your brain isn't receiving the right nutrients, then it's not going to function properly, and that affects how you think, right? You could also change your external environment and thus your internal environment by breaking up with an abusive spouse, moving out of your parents' house, removing yourself from a toxic relationship, finding a new job, getting a hobby, or moving across the country. So many different ways that you can change your external environment. And tell me that doesn't change your internal environment too. I mean, it can be traumatic to move across the country, and that affects your stress levels, which can give way to viruses being able to proliferate. I know from firsthand experience that going through a divorce is extremely traumatic. And I found that what usually stands in people's way of making these changes to their external and internal environment is fear. It's a lack of self-trust. They don't know, like, or trust themselves enough to make their own decisions, so they seek outside validation and direction on pretty much every major decision in their lives. They go to a psychiatrist and say, this is happening and I don't know how to deal with it. And the psychiatrist is like, here, you can take this pill and it will make your symptoms go away or decrease your symptoms. And what people don't realize is that pill is changing their internal environment in a way that is not actually helping. It's actually hurting them. People don't understand what's going on in their inner world enough. That's why Brene Brown's book is so helpful, learning about what's going on and being able to articulate that. And we've been conditioned by external factors. Like I said before, our parents, teachers, clergy, these types of authorities we rely on to tell us what's wrong and how to fix it. The almighty psychiatrist can tell us more about us than we can, apparently. We've lost the ability to listen to our own bodies. It's a lost art. It's kind of like we're walking around with a handicap. If you're super into reading and you want to read more about this, there's a book by Dr. Bruce Lipton. He is a cellular molecular biologist, and he's a PhD. He teaches biology to college students too. Oh, he's a researcher. He's done a lot of research at Stanford. He has a book called The Biology of Belief, and it explains in great detail how our environment affects our beliefs about ourselves. It also affects our beliefs about others and the world around us. And that's what makes it so easy for people to fall prey to the lies that are found in the DSM and throughout the entirety of the mental health industrial complex. They've been brainwashed ever so slowly for their entire lives to completely deny and suppress their inner knowing and just trust the man in the white coat because he knows more than you do, even about yourself. And trust me when I tell you, you want to steer clear of any doctor or any therapist even who believes that they have answers about you and your mind that you need their assistance to learn. It is complete bullshit. They don't have answers that you don't. You can figure it out without their assistance. You're not required to see a psychiatrist to learn about your soul and your emotional health. Of course, they're not going to tell you that. They're going to tell you that you need to be treated because you have a disorder, and it's total bullshit. The problem is most of medical science doesn't consider anything but the physical and completely neglects the spiritual, the emotional, and these kinds of aspects of our health. We're body, mind, and spirit. It's physical, mental, spiritual, emotional, all these things. We're very multidimensional beings. You've heard me say that before. We're multidimensional beings. We're not just these bodies. There's more to our health than just our biology. There's more to us than just our biology. But all of this and how they've marketed themselves, this is how the mass psychosis of mental illness can take root in a society. If you can control someone's perception of their reality, this is where the gaslighting concept comes in. You can control someone's beliefs, control their understanding of their own reality by convincing them that they're sick using really slick marketing campaigns, by inducing fear in them through direct advertising to their home TV, telling them there's an epidemic of epic proportions sweeping the globe, and then also teach them by multiple avenues that the doctors know best, even when they don't know you from Adam. You can control everything that person does because you've shaped their understanding of reality in a way that makes them devilishly easy to manipulate. And they're especially easy to manipulate if you get them dependent on more than one drug, even one drug. And these drugs are cleverly dubbed medication to treat their chronic illness. And the drugs affect your ability to think with clarity, and it dulls your body's ability to vibrate at higher frequencies that allow you to heal yourself. Dr. Bruce Lipton's book goes into this in much higher detail, and I encourage you to read that. It'll blow your mind. Okay, fact number 3. That was a long fact, but we're into fact number 3, and that's that the DSM does not address treatment or medications for any disorder. I think a lot of people don't realize this, that it truly is just a book of descriptions of these disorders, lists of symptoms, but it doesn't talk about how to treat the disorders or any of the medications, probably because that would be an outright reveal of, hey, we're working very closely with drug companies to manipulate you. They're letting the advertising do its job. And I just want to know which manual does address treatment or medications. How do psychiatrists make those decisions if it's not based on the marketing information that they get from drug companies? I think that's how they make their decisions. I mean, when I asked for information on Zyprexa, an antipsychotic that they told me I needed for my bipolar disorder, and it was different from the medication that they'd given me in the previous hospital with the same so-called diagnosis. They gave me Abilify, which is called a mood stabilizer, but it's actually also a type of antipsychotic. But mood stabilizer sounds less scary, and so they can market it differently. I asked for information on Zyprexa, and they gave me a handout that came from a drug company consulting agency. It was marketing. So we don't really know how psychiatrists make their decision, but that kind of leaves it for us to imagine. If there's no manual on which drug should be used for which disorder, and there's really no way to know whether someone has a disorder or not because there's no tests for those disorders, then it's truly just a freaking elaborate guessing game. And how many psychiatrists do you know spend their free time reading through studies that were paid for by drug companies to make sure that they're valid studies? Right? Probably none. They're not getting paid for that time at all, and they can make more money if they see more patients and prescribe more drugs. It's just faster to be a pill mill. And just because I love statistics, I found some shocking ones for you. The use of psychotropic drugs by adult Americans increased 22% from 2001 to 2010. 22%. Doesn't seem like a very high number, but if you think about how much 22% represents, that means over 1 in 5 adults. That means 2.2 adults, right? Because 22%. 2.2 adults in 5 are now taking at least one psychotropic medication, according to industry data. In 2010, Americans spent more than $16 billion, that's billion with a B, on antipsychotics, $11 billion on antidepressants, and $7 billion for drugs to treat ADHD. I didn't know that. I was shocked when I saw this, that they spend more than $16 billion on antipsychotics. I always was thinking that it would be antidepressants that people spent the most money on, but antipsychotics are the most dangerous. Antidepressants are really dangerous too, but there's a lot of studies that show antipsychotics being damaging to the brain, like no question. There's more definitive evidence that these drugs damage the brain than there is that they actually help. Fact number 4, the DSM is published by the American Psychiatric Association's own publishing company. So basically, it's self-published. That means they get to define what it is, and it is whatever they say it is. And it's true because we say it's true. We don't know anything about the mental state of the people who worked on it. Does anyone evaluate the mental health of psychiatrists? It's just arrogant. And how the APA, they have their own definition, right? And it says, and this is at the bottom of their fact sheets, it's on their website, it says, the APA is a national medical specialty society whose more than 37,000 physician members specialize in the diagnosis, treatment, prevention, and research of mental illnesses, including substance use disorders. That's how they describe themselves, as a medical specialty society. And they have 37,000 physician members. And something I was thinking about recently was just the word physician. It's got the same root as physical. And if psychiatry, the meaning of the word psychiatry originally meant soul healing, then doesn't that take a special type of education more so than physicians? Like, they don't study the soul, they don't believe it exists, they're physicians. They only specialize in the physical. And that's why there's been such a push for trying to find these biological reasons for so-called abnormal behavior that just don't exist, because they're physicians and they don't believe the soul is real. What's even crazier to me is that many mental health practitioners and psychiatrists, and I don't have any proof for this, but I would venture to say that the vast majority haven't experienced the extremes of what they call mental illness. So they've never experienced it for themselves. And that's what makes them just memorizing this dictionary of terms so unreliable, because they have no idea how their patients are feeling. They have absolutely no empathy because they don't know what it's like. They don't know what it's like to be suicidal. They don't know what it's like. Maybe some of them do, but I think for the people who've been through it and made it out to the other side, it's not their first instinct to go, I think I'm going to become a psychiatrist, you know? And of course, there are psychiatrists out there like my favorite, Dr. Peter Breggin, who is more in tune with what psychiatry was always supposed to be. Soul healing is something much more than physical, is what it should be, but that's not what it is. Fact number 5, the DSM is not reliable or valid by scientific standards, yet they purport it to be scientific. Now, it's been under fire of criticism since the beginning. Critics claimed that the manual lacked what in the world of science is known as reliability. And what is reliability? It's the ability to produce a consistent or replicable result. And because it lacked reliability, it also lacked scientific validity. In order for any diagnostic instrument, whether it's the DSM or something else in another field of science, so-called science, to be considered useful, it has to have both reliability and validity. But because it lacks reliability, it doesn't produce consistent, replicable results, then it by default lacks validity in a scientific standpoint. And if psychiatrists can't agree on a patient's condition, then how are they going to agree on how to treat that condition? And that means essentially that there's no relationship between the diagnosis and the treatment and the cure. Alan Francis, now he worked under Robert Spitzer. He went by Bob. We'll call him Bob. Bob Spitzer on the DSM-3 was appointed the director of the DSM-4 in 1987. He said, without reliability, the system is completely random, and the diagnoses mean almost nothing, maybe worse than nothing, because they're falsely labeling. You're better off not having a diagnostic system. Ooh, that's pretty scathing, in my opinion. Now, so this is something I pulled directly from the DSM-5 text revision, the most up-to-date version of the DSM-5. It's from the introduction. It says, since a complete description of the underlying pathological processes is not possible for most mental disorders, it is important to emphasize that the current diagnostic criteria are the best available description of how mental disorders are expressed and can be recognized by trained clinicians. It goes on to say, DSM is intended to serve as a practical, functional, and flexible guide. Oh yeah, it's flexible. For organizing information that can aid in the accurate diagnosis and treatment of mental disorders. It is a tool for clinicians, an essential educational resource for students and practitioners, and a reference for researchers in the field. Now, I specifically highlighted the very first part of this because it's very revealing, but it gets buried in all this word salad. That's like 2 sentences. It was a whole paragraph, but it's only 2 sentences. The very first part is so key. It says, I'll repeat it, since a complete description of the underlying pathological processes, that's what they mean by cause, is not possible for most mental disorders. They are admitting this, y'all. The complete description of the underlying cause is not possible for most mental disorders. They bury this bullshit in words like pathological processes. That's the cause, because they cannot find the cause in the physical realm. It doesn't exist. A physical cause does not exist. Not in the way that they're saying it does. And it baffles me. Most of us are so stressed and so busy with our lives that we're not going to look past the surface. We're not going to dig in to find the truth and to see whether what they're feeding us is real or not. And that's what's so dangerous, is so many of us believe and have been conditioned to believe by the marketing, the very clever marketing that these people are putting out, that what they're saying is true, and it's not. And that's dangerous. And finally, this is our last fact. Save the best for last here. It's going to get a little controversial. I'm not going to lie here. We mentioned this in a previous episode, so it's not going to come as very big of a surprise, but a little bit more detail here. So the DSM has removed diagnoses before, and this proves that they were not and still are not based on facts, but on prejudice and bias. And if prejudice and biased diagnoses, like homosexuality, can all at once just be classified as mental illness and then systematically removed, what does that tell us about the validity of the other diagnoses in the DSM? Now, is the main difference that so-called illnesses like depression and generalized anxiety disorder were marketed extremely effectively? I think so. Marketing generalized anxiety disorder allowed drug companies to literally fabricate an epidemic out of our emotions and our difficulties in dealing with our lives. But it's not exactly straightforward to do the same thing with homosexuality, is it? Can you imagine? TV commercials telling us to call our doctor and ask about a drug that will ungay us? Right? Can you imagine that? But that's essentially what they were doing with generalized anxiety disorder. They marketed the disorder and not the drug. The TV commercials talked about how a lot of us have this new disorder, and that's how they got us. That's how they got us to go to our doctors and ask for antidepressants. Even the word antidepressant is marketing. And homosexuality was included in the DSM until the DSM-3. The 7th printing of the DSM-2, they did take it out. I have the 6th printing, which still has it in. The DSM-3 came out in 1980, so if the APA would erase a diagnosis for any reason other than scientific discovery, how many other diagnoses were equally unfounded? And the fact that they removed the diagnoses for reasons other than scientific discovery proves that the APA also adds diagnoses without scientific discovery. They never had proof that homosexuality was a disorder. They just decided that it was. There was no scientific discovery that warranted adding it into the DSM. There was no scientific discovery that warranted adding of any of the disorders. It was easier for them to just remove the diagnosis of homosexuality as a disorder altogether than to fight for its validity because it's not valid. But there wasn't any money to be made off of it. And this is unfortunate, but there's so many people in the LGBTQ community who have gotten the news from a psychiatrist that they trust, they shouldn't, but they do, that they have a lifelong mental illness and they've been prescribed psychiatric drugs for 1, 2, 3 more of the hundreds of so-called disorders that are also found in the DSM. The same people that told them that they had a disorder back in the 70s are telling them they have another disorder. And they don't know that they're blindly accepting their doctor's opinions as valid, reliable, verifiable, when it's not. Homosexuality is not a real disease, and neither are the other diseases that are listed in the DSM. Well, that about wraps it up. That was the top 6 most alarming facts about the DSM, also known as the Bible of Psychiatry. That was the foundation for where we're going to be going. In the next couple of episodes, we're going to be tearing it apart a little bit more I'm still reading through the Book of Woe, which is the DSM and the Unmaking of Psychiatry by Gary Greenberg. It's taken me a lot of index to research. I'm pulling from that. It's really, really good. But there's so many more disturbing, alarming, shocking facts about the DSM that I need to share with you, because while not everybody has the time to dig through to find the truth, I'm doing it so you don't have to. Thanks for tuning in to Misdiagnosed. I'm Caitlin Pyle, and I'll see you in the next episode. Thank you so much for tuning in to Misdiagnosed. If this show has helped you in any way, please consider leaving a 5-star review on iTunes. Sharing your experience will help others who are lost in the darkness find their own way out of the science of lies. Please note that while I may go in depth into medical topics and have acquired substantial medical knowledge, I am not a medical doctor. I'm a researcher. I'm a messenger of hope for other survivors of industrialized psychiatry. Because of how toxic psychiatric drugs are, it can be extremely dangerous, even life-threatening, to suddenly stop taking certain drugs. This is especially true for antidepressants, antipsychotics, and benzodiazepines. The longer you've taken the drug, the more dangerous withdrawal can be. If you want to heal your brain and soul naturally, the way it was designed to do, please seek the help of a compassionate and patient-centered physician to start the process of withdrawing from them as safely as possible. It will take time for your brain to reacclimate to life without the drugs, and there are doctors out there who will support you in your quest to save your brain. Never give up. You can heal.